So I'm going to talk about how startups in today's world have gone about and gotten the big prices and valuations against their names and raised lots of money. Of course, that's a dream for every startup to uh, be the next billionaire and the next unicorn in the industry. But to take those steps, one has to make sure that legally you are 100% compliant and you are not signing off on documents where your rights in the future can possibly get impacted to a point where you either get diluted and don't make the most of the kind of energy that you have put in to sustain and run your business, or you don't agree to certain rights which from an investor's perspective can be extremely investor friendly to a point that you are asked to exit the company. So if you think about how things start, the first thing that a startup actually has to do is to find an investor and then negotiate the broad terms of an investment, and that is typically done face to face. Once the broad terms are agreed, then a term sheet is signed, and at the stage of executing a term sheet, one has to keep in mind certain key clauses. And to start with, a term sheet would typically include what your pre and post money valuation is going to be, how many shares are going to be allotted to the investor. So the first and foremost aspect that one has to look at is what are the kind of securities that are actually going to be offered to the investor. Typically, these are called CCPSs, or compulsorily convertible preference shares. The reason most investors opt for this kind of security is because it gives them certain rights which are not ordinarily associated with common stock, or commonly known as equity. Another form of funding that most startups have actually gone ahead and got is in the form of debt. For domestic, if you are looking to raise money from a domestic investor, then one of the things that startups actually go ahead and do is sign a convertible note, wherein what you essentially state is that, look, my startup is at a very early stage. We possibly cannot do a valuation because we don't have enough numbers and enough business or enough basis to justify the valuation of our company. However, you can put in money in our company at this point of time, which whenever we raise our next round of funding would be converted into equity at a certain discount. This does not apply to foreign investors because such kind of instruments vis-a-vis foreign investors are treated as debt, and then when the money comes in, it's treated in the form of external commercial borrowings, which then raises problems for the startup as well as the investor. So once it's decided the kind of security that's going to be allotted, the next few steps or the next few clauses that one has to negotiate pertain to who's going to come on board. Are there going to be any promoter lock-ins? What are the kind of anti-dilution protections that the investor is looking at? What is the kind of liquidation clause that the investor has secured against the investors? And it's important that one understands the repercussions and consequences of each of these clauses. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to quickly run you by some of the key clauses which perhaps are worthwhile looking into, even though as an early stage startup you may not be in a position to negotiate them to completely your advantage. So let's talk a little bit about liquidation preference clauses. What this essentially means is that if at all a liquidation event gets triggered, which doesn't necessarily mean that your company is being wound up, but what it means is that there is any kind of rearrangement, corporate reorganization that's taking place in the company, the investor wants to secure its investment. So what it typically would say is, look, I want a 1x liquidation preference, and of course I'm using these jargons very simply. That would necessarily imply is that if the company has, say, raised money, has raised, say, about $10 million, and the investor has put in $10 million, then what the investor is saying is that if there is any kind of a liquidation event that gets triggered, he is going to get his $10 million back. So if the worth of the company is, say, 25 million, then at the time of exit, the investor is going to walk away with 10 million. Now, let's also assume another situation that most investors actually prefer which is when they are actually participating at the time of a liquidation preference. That would mean that if the company's valuation is, say, 25 million and they've put in 10 million, so not only do they get 10 10 million back, but if they are, say, a 50% shareholder in the company, out of the balance 15 million that's left, they are entitled to 50%. So that's another $6 million that comes into their kitty. So that's about $16 million that they've got. So when one's looking at liquidation preference clauses, you want to try and understand what actually is the investor looking to get and how best you can negotiate that. So from a startup's perspective, what's important is that at best you manage to negotiate a 1x liquidation preference, which is not participating. But from an investor's perspective, of course, they'd like to get participating rights at the stage of a liquidation preference.